My name is Aria Thompson, and I never imagined that the most devastating betrayal of my life would come wrapped in pixels and posted for the world to see. This is the story of how my husband turned my deepest vulnerabilities into viral entertainment, and how I rose from the ashes of digital humiliation to reclaim my power. At 31, I thought I had it all figured out. A successful career as a software engineer at a tech startup in Austin, Texas, a beautiful home in the hills, and most importantly, what I believed was a loving marriage to Connor Walsh, a charismatic marketing director who seemed to understand my introverted nature better than anyone ever had. Connor was everything I wasn't: outgoing, socially confident, the kind of person who could work a room and make everyone feel like his best friend. When we met at an industry conference 3 years earlier, I was immediately drawn to his warmth and his apparent appreciation for my quieter strengths. "You see things differently than everyone else," he'd tell me during our early courtship. "Your mind works in ways that fascinate me. I love watching you think through problems." I believed him completely. In a world where I often felt like an outsider looking in, Connor made me feel valued for exactly who I was. When he proposed on the anniversary of our first date, with a ring he'd designed himself and a speech about how my authenticity was what made him fall in love with me, I thought I'd found my person. Our wedding was small and intimate, exactly what I'd wanted. Connor had pushed for something bigger, more elaborate, but he ultimately deferred to my preferences, with what seemed like understanding and love. "This is your day," he'd said, squeezing my hand as we finalized the details. "I want you to feel completely comfortable and beautiful." The first 2 years of marriage were everything I'd dreamed of. Connor supported my career ambitions, encouraged my hobbies, and seemed genuinely proud to be married to someone he called the smartest person I know. When I struggled with anxiety about social situations, he was patient and supportive, never pushing me beyond my comfort zone. But looking back now, I can see the signs I missed. The way he'd sometimes pull out his phone during our private moments, claiming he needed to document our happiness. He'd encourage me to share more personal stories at dinner parties, then watch the reactions of others with an intensity that should have made me uncomfortable. The subtle ways he'd push me to be more vulnerable, more open, always framing it as growth and healing. If you're already feeling the tension building in this story, you won't want to miss what happens next. Hit that subscribe button now, because this journey is about to take a turn that will leave you speechless. The betrayal began innocuously enough, with what Connor called his passion project. He'd always been interested in content creation, running a modest lifestyle blog and YouTube channel that focused on career advice and personal development. His content was polished and engaging, though it never gained the massive following he clearly craved. "I want to help people," he'd explain when I'd find him editing videos late into the night. "There's so much fake positivity out there. People need real, authentic content about relationships and personal growth." I supported his creative pursuits, even when they began consuming more and more of his free time. When he asked if I'd be willing to appear in some of his content, I initially hesitated. The thought of being on camera, of having strangers scrutinize my appearance and personality, filled me with dread. "You don't have to if you're not comfortable," Connor assured me. "But I think people would really connect with your story. You've overcome so much social anxiety, built such a successful career despite being introverted. You could inspire other women who struggle with similar challenges." The way he framed it made it seem noble, almost like a responsibility. Gradually, I began appearing in his videos, though always reluctantly and usually only for brief segments. Connor was patient, never pushing too hard, always making me feel like my comfort was his primary concern. The content performed well. Connor's audience responded positively to my appearances, with comments praising my realness and authenticity. Connor was thrilled, and I felt a small glow of pride that maybe, despite my fears, I was helping people. That's when Connor suggested we document my pregnancy. We'd been trying to conceive for 8 months when I finally saw those 2 pink lines. I was simultaneously thrilled and terrified, excited about becoming a mother but anxious about all the changes that lay ahead. When I told Connor, he was over the moon, immediately pulling out his phone to capture my reaction. "This is such a beautiful moment," he said, filming as tears of joy streamed down my face. "Our audience is going to love sharing this journey with us." I felt a flicker of unease. Our audience? I hadn't agreed to make my pregnancy content, but Connor was already mentally planning the series. Think about it, he continued, his enthusiasm building. Pregnancy content is incredibly popular. We could help so many women who are going through the same experience. And documenting everything will give us such beautiful memories to look back on. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Connor promised we'd keep things tasteful and that I'd have final approval over anything that got posted. For the first few months, he kept that promise. The pregnancy content was sweet and informative, focusing on health tips and emotional preparation for parenthood. But as my pregnancy progressed and my body changed, I began feeling increasingly uncomfortable with the level of documentation Connor was requesting. He wanted to film everything: doctor's appointments, my emotional breakdowns, private moments that I felt should remain between us. Authenticity is what sets us apart, he'd argue when I pushed back. People can tell when content is sanitized and fake. They connect with the real stuff, the vulnerable moments. I started noticing changes in how Connor interacted with me when the camera wasn't rolling. He seemed less patient with my mood swings, less understanding of my physical discomfort. It was as if the real me, the one experiencing pregnancy in all its messy reality, was inconvenient compared to the curated version he was creating for his audience. The breaking point came during my 7th month. I was having a particularly difficult day, swollen, exhausted, and emotional about how different I looked and felt. I'd spent the afternoon crying in our bedroom, feeling disconnected from my own body and overwhelmed by the changes ahead. Connor found me there and, instead of offering comfort, immediately began filming. "This is exactly the kind of real content people need to see," he said, pointing his phone at my tear-streaked face. "So many pregnancy influencers only show the glamorous side. You're showing what it's really like." "Turn it off," I said, trying to shield my face. "Please, I don't want to be filmed right now." "Come on, Arya. You look beautiful. This vulnerability is powerful." I said turn it off. I grabbed for his phone, and in the struggle, it fell to the floor. Connor's expression changed instantly, transforming from encouraging to cold. "Fine," he said, picking up his phone and checking for damage. "But you're being selfish. This content could help thousands of women feel less alone in their struggles." That night, I lay awake thinking about Connor's words. Was I being selfish? Was my discomfort with sharing my most vulnerable moments preventing me from helping others? Connor had always been better at understanding people, at knowing what was right for his audience. Maybe I was just being oversensitive. Against my instincts, I apologized the next morning and agreed to continue participating in the content creation. Connor accepted my apology graciously, telling me he understood that pregnancy hormones were making me more emotional than usual. "We're a team," he said, kissing my forehead. "We're building something important together." The content continued, and Connor's channel grew rapidly. What had started as a modest lifestyle blog was becoming a significant income source, with sponsorship deals and brand partnerships rolling in. Connor quit his marketing job to focus on content creation full-time, framing it as an investment in our family's future. "This could set us up for life," he explained. "By the time the baby comes, we could be financially independent. Isn't that worth some temporary discomfort?" I gave birth to our daughter Emma on a rainy Tuesday in March. The labor was long and difficult, but holding her for the first time filled me with a love I'd never imagined possible. In that moment, exhausted and overwhelmed with emotion, I felt complete. Connor was there for the entire birth, and I was grateful for his support. What I didn't realize until later was that he'd been filming much of it, capturing my most vulnerable and painful moments, without my explicit consent. "The birth story video is going to be incredible," he told me as I recovered in the hospital. "It's so raw and real. People are going to be moved to tears." I felt that familiar unease creeping in. "Connor, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with you posting footage of me giving birth. That feels too private." "It's not graphic," he assured me. "Just your face, your emotions. It's beautiful, Arya. It shows the incredible strength women have." I was too exhausted to argue, still riding the emotional high of Emma's arrival. When Connor promised to edit out anything too personal, I reluctantly agreed. The birth story video exploded online. Within days, it had hundreds of thousands of views and was being shared across social media platforms. Comments poured in praising the authentic portrayal of motherhood and my incredible bravery in sharing such an intimate experience. Connor was ecstatic. Brand deals poured in, and his follower count skyrocketed. He was invited to speak at conferences and podcast interviews, suddenly positioned as an expert on authentic content creation and family lifestyle brands. But as I scrolled through the comments, I felt increasingly uncomfortable. Many were supportive, but others were invasive and judgmental. Strangers were analyzing my appearance, critiquing my reactions, and offering unsolicited advice about my labor and delivery. "This is what fame feels like," Connor said dismissively when I brought up my concerns. "You can't let a few negative comments get to you. Look at all the positive impact we're having." Over the following months, Connor's content creation became increasingly intrusive. He documented Emma's first weeks with relentless detail, filming my struggles with breastfeeding, my postpartum body, and my emotional adjustment to motherhood. Every private moment seemed to become potential content. "People need to see this," became his constant refrain whenever I objected. "You're helping new mothers feel less alone." But I was feeling more alone than ever. The woman in Connor's videos, patient, glowing, confidently navigating new motherhood, bore little resemblance to how I actually felt. Behind the camera, I was struggling with sleep deprivation, anxiety about Emma's health and development, and a growing sense that I was losing myself in this new role. Connor seemed to have less patience for the real version of me. When I was too tired to film, too emotional to be camera-ready, or simply needed privacy to process my experiences, he became frustrated and distant. "This is our career now," he'd remind me. "We have obligations to our audience. They're counting on us for consistent content." The audience. Always the audience. I began to feel like our family existed primarily for their entertainment, like my most intimate experiences were being commodified for views and engagement. The final straw came when Emma was 6 months old. I'd been dealing with postpartum depression, something I'd been trying to keep private while I sought help from a therapist. Connor knew I was struggling, but he also saw it as a content opportunity. "Mental health content performs really well," he told me after I'd had a particularly difficult day. "If you shared your experience with postpartum depression, you could help so many other women." "I'm not ready to talk about this publicly," I said firmly. "I'm still figuring it out myself." "You don't have to go into detail. Just acknowledge that you're going through something. Show people that it's normal to struggle." I refused, and Connor seemed to accept my decision. But a week later, I discovered he'd been filming me without my knowledge during some of my lowest moments, capturing me crying while trying to calm a fussy Emma, documenting my exhaustion and emotional breakdowns with hidden cameras around our house. The betrayal was devastating. The man I'd trusted with my deepest vulnerabilities had been treating them as content opportunities, monetizing my pain for his audience's consumption. When I confronted him, Connor initially denied it, then tried to justify his actions. "I was trying to help you," he claimed. "You're so hard on yourself, but the footage shows how good of a mother you actually are, even when you're struggling. People need to see that real motherhood isn't perfect." "You violated my privacy," I said, my voice shaking with anger and hurt. "You filmed me without my consent during the most difficult period of my life." "Everything I do is for our family," Connor shot back. "This content is paying for our house, Emma's future, and your maternity leave. You're being ungrateful." That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done being content for Connor's career. I was done having my life curated and packaged for strangers' consumption. I was taking back control. I started by changing all the passwords to our shared accounts and removing Connor's access to the social media platforms where our content lived. When he woke up the next morning and discovered what I'd done, he was furious. "You can't just destroy everything we've built," he raged. "That's our livelihood. That's Emma's college fund. That's my life you've been selling," I replied calmly. "And I'm taking it back." Over the next several days, Connor tried everything to convince me to reverse my decision. He apologized, promised to be more respectful of my boundaries, and offered to give me creative control over all future content. But I'd seen behind the curtain. I knew that to Connor I wasn't a wife, I was a brand. Emma wasn't his daughter, she was content. The divorce proceedings were ugly. Connor tried to claim ownership of the social media accounts and content we'd created together, arguing that they were marital assets. He hired an expensive lawyer and fought for half of everything, including the revenue generated from videos featuring my most intimate moments. But I had something Connor didn't expect: evidence of his deception. The hidden cameras, the footage filmed without my consent, and the messages between him and his editor discussed how to punch up the drama in our family content. My lawyer used all of it to paint a picture of exploitation and violation of privacy. The court ruled largely in my favor. I retained full control of all content featuring me and Emma, and Connor was required to remove any videos I didn't consent to from his platforms. The financial settlement was modest. Most of the income from the content had already been spent on Connor's lifestyle and equipment, but I didn't care about the money. I cared about reclaiming my story. Connor was devastated by the loss of his platform and audience. Without access to the family content that had made him internet famous, his remaining videos struggled to gain traction. Brands that had once courted him dropped their partnerships, and his speaking engagements dried up. He tried to rebuild, launching a new channel focused on his experience as a canceled creator and the injustices of the family court system. But his audience could sense the difference. The authenticity that had once made his content compelling was gone, replaced by bitterness and self-pity. Meanwhile, I was learning to live again. The first few months after leaving Connor were terrifying. I'd been so wrapped up in his version of our life that I'd forgotten who I was outside of his narrative. But slowly, with the help of therapy and the support of friends I'd neglected during my marriage, I began to remember. I returned to work, grateful for the intellectual challenge and the financial independence it provided. Emma and I moved into a small apartment across town, and I discovered the joy of privacy, of living moments without documenting them, of being present instead of performing. A year after our divorce was finalized, Connor made one last attempt to exploit our relationship. He released a tell-all video titled, "My Ex-Wife Destroyed My Career," painting himself as the victim of a vindictive woman who couldn't handle the pressures of internet fame. The video went viral, but not in the way Connor expected. Instead of sympathy, he received overwhelming criticism. Viewers who had followed our content recognized the manipulation and exploitation he'd subjected me to. Women shared their own stories of partners who had violated their privacy for social media content. The conversation became less about Connor's career and more about the ethics of family content creation and the exploitation of intimate relationships for online entertainment. I never responded publicly to Connor's video. I didn't need to. The truth was evident to anyone willing to see it, and I had no interest in continuing to be part of his narrative, even as an adversary. Instead, I focused on building a new life for Emma and me. I started consulting for tech companies on digital privacy and ethics, drawing on my experience to help organizations develop more responsible approaches to user data and content creation. The work was fulfilling in ways that Connor's brand partnerships never had been. 2 years after our divorce, I met David Chin at a conference on digital ethics. He was a professor of media studies at the University of Texas, researching the psychological impact of social media on families and children. When I told him my story, he didn't see content potential. He saw a human being who had survived something traumatic and was using her experience to help others. Our relationship developed slowly and privately. David understood my need for boundaries, my wariness of sharing personal details, my desire to keep Emma out of any public narrative. When he proposed, he did it in our living room with Emma playing nearby. No cameras, no documentation, just a quiet moment between two people who had chosen each other. "I love you exactly as you are," he said, "not as content, not as a story, just as you." We were married in a small ceremony with just our immediate families present. No social media posts, no documentation beyond a few private photos for our own memories. It was everything my first wedding hadn't been: intimate, authentic, and completely ours. Connor continued to struggle professionally. His attempts to reinvent himself as a men's rights activist and critic of cancel culture gained him a small, toxic following but alienated him from mainstream opportunities. The last I heard, he was working part-time for a local marketing agency and living in a studio apartment, a far cry from the lifestyle his content career had briefly afforded him. Emma, now 4 years old, has no memory of the cameras and content creation that defined her first months of life. She's growing up in an environment where her privacy is protected, where her childhood is hers to experience rather than perform. When she's old enough, I'll explain why there are so few photos and videos from her infancy, and I'll let her decide how much of her life she wants to share with the world. Recently, I was contacted by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell my story as part of a series about exploitation in family content creation. I declined the interview, but I did provide some insights for their research, hoping that other families might learn from my experience. The digital age has given us unprecedented opportunities to connect, create, and share our experiences. But it's also created new forms of exploitation and violation that we're still learning to recognize and address. My story isn't unique. There are thousands of women and children whose intimate moments have been commodified for someone else's benefit, whose vulnerabilities have been repackaged as content. The most insidious part of this exploitation is how it's often framed as love, as sharing, as helping others. Connor genuinely believed, or at least convinced himself, that documenting and monetizing our most private moments was altruistic. He saw himself as providing valuable content, helping other families, and building something meaningful. But intent doesn't negate impact. Regardless of Connor's motivations, the effect was the same. My privacy was violated, my consent was disregarded, and my identity became secondary to the narrative he was creating for his audience. Recovery from this kind of betrayal is complex because it involves grieving not just a relationship, but a version of yourself that was created for public consumption. I had to learn to distinguish between the woman Connor had presented to his audience and who I actually was. I had to reclaim parts of my identity that had been edited, curated, and packaged for strangers' entertainment. The process taught me valuable lessons about boundaries, consent, and the importance of controlling your own narrative. It also showed me the incredible resilience of the human spirit and the possibility of rebuilding after even the most devastating betrayals. Today, I work with families and individuals who have experienced similar exploitation, helping them understand their rights and develop strategies for protecting their privacy in an increasingly connected world. The work is challenging but rewarding, turning my painful experience into something that can help others avoid similar trauma. Emma and I live quietly but happily. She attends a wonderful preschool where she's learning to read and discovering her love for music. I've started dating David, the professor who sees me as a complete person rather than content with potential. Our relationship is private, authentic, and built on mutual respect, everything my marriage to Connor wasn't. Sometimes people ask if I regret my time as a content creator, if I wish I'd never agreed to appear in Connor's videos. The answer is complicated. I regret the violation of my privacy and the exploitation of my vulnerabilities. I regret that Emma's earliest months were documented and monetized without her consent. But I don't regret the journey that led me to where I am today. The experience taught me things about myself, about relationships, and about the importance of maintaining agency over your own story that I might never have learned otherwise. It showed me that I'm stronger than I thought, more resilient than I knew, and capable of rebuilding my life from the ground up. Most importantly, it taught me that authenticity isn't about sharing everything with everyone. True authenticity is about being honest with yourself about who you are, what you want, and what you're willing to sacrifice for others' approval or entertainment. Connor tried to turn my life into content, but in the end, I turned my experience into purpose. He may have monetized my vulnerabilities temporarily, but I transformed them into strength that can't be commodified or exploited. The woman who once felt powerless against her husband's camera has become an advocate for digital privacy rights. The mother who was afraid to speak up for herself has found her voice and uses it to protect other families. The wife who lost herself in someone else's narrative has learned to write her own story. And that story, the real one, not the curated version Connor created, is still being written. Each day, Emma and I add new chapters filled with private moments that belong only to us, authentic experiences that exist without documentation, and genuine connections that don't require an audience to validate them. In a world obsessed with sharing, we've learned the radical power of keeping some things sacred. In a culture that equates visibility with value, we've discovered that the most meaningful parts of life often happen away from cameras and screens. Connor taught me that love without respect is exploitation, that intimacy without consent is violation, and that sharing without boundaries is not generosity, but self-destruction. But life after Connor has taught me that healing is possible, that boundaries can be rebuilt, and that it's never too late to reclaim your own story. The cameras are off now, but the life I'm living is more authentic than anything I ever performed for Connor's audience. Emma is growing up free from the burden of being content, and I'm learning to exist without documentation, to experience moments without immediately thinking about how they'll be perceived by others. This is what freedom looks like after digital exploitation: quiet, private, and completely our own. And that's exactly how we like it. Aria's journey from exploitation to empowerment reminds us that in our hyper-connected world, the most radical act might be choosing privacy over publicity, authenticity over performance, and real relationships over digital validation. Her story proves that it's possible to rebuild after even the most intimate betrayals, and that sometimes the greatest strength comes from knowing when to turn off the cameras and simply live. What boundaries do you think are important in the digital age? How do we balance sharing our lives with protecting our privacy? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories about resilience, recovery, and reclaiming your own narrative in an age of constant documentation.